Now, today, at that summit for peace in Cairo, Jordan's King Abdullah called for a, quote, immediate end to the war on Gaza and a lasting resolution on the basis of the two-state solution. Joining me now is CNN's Nada Bashir, who is in Amman. Nada, thank you for being here. Amman has been one of the many scenes of an anti-Israel, anti-West protest. It occurs to me that we're only 2 weeks removed from the Hamas attack on Israel. That Israel was the subject of such cruelty seems to have earned it no sympathy with any of those pro-Palestinian protesters. Why?
Well, look, I do think that is an unfair way to characterize what we are seeing happening in Jordan and in much of the Middle East. When we speak to protesters on the ground, the vast majority of them tell us this is not about Hamas. This is not about expressing any indifference to the attacks against Israeli civilians on October 7th. In fact, for the vast majority of the people that we've been speaking to here in Jordan, and indeed people that we've been speaking to across the region, this is about a conflict, an issue, a crisis which began long before October 7th. These are pro-Palestinian protesters. They are demonstrating against Israel's airstrikes on the Gaza Strip, which, as we know, have had a devastating humanitarian toll, a devastating human toll, that death toll rising, as Clarissa mentioned, by the day, by the hour. And of course, for many here, this is a call for an end to the siege on Gaza, an end to the blockade. As I said, for many, this began long before October 7th. This is about more than just what we're seeing happening now in Gaza. This is about the violence that we're seeing in the West Bank. This is about the expansion of settlements, which are considered by many in the international community to be illegal under international law. This is a crisis, an issue, a cause which is central to many here in Jordan, when half of the population are either Palestinian or of Palestinian descent, and that is felt and reflected across the Middle East. Now, look, you mentioned King Abdullah of Jordan there condemning the violence that we are seeing, and I think something that he said today at the Cairo Peace Summit really characterizes and captures what many people on the streets of Amman and across the Middle East are feeling. Let me just read you a bit of what he had to say. He said, "The relentless bombing campaign underway in Gaza as we speak is cruel and unconscionable on every level. It is collective punishment of a besieged and helpless people. It is a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. It is a war crime. Anywhere else attacking civilian infrastructure and deliberately starving an entire population of food, water, electricity and basic necessities would be condemned." This is the message from King Abdullah of Jordan. This is the message that we have been hearing across the Middle East. This is the rallying cry that we have been hearing from protesters here in Amman. And as you well know, this is the message that we have been hearing from international rights groups, aid groups, NGOs on the ground who are trying to alleviate what Clarissa just mentioned is an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip.
I certainly understand that. I guess my point was to say that notwithstanding the history and complexity of the issue, to see tens of thousands of people rallying as they are just does not seem to recognize the suffering that only 2 weeks ago the Israelis endured.
Again, I don't think this is an expression of indifference to those attacks. That is certainly not the message we've been hearing from protesters that we've been speaking to. The focus of these protests is on the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe that is happening in Gaza. The focus, when you hear the chants, when you speak to people on the ground here in Amman and across the Middle East, is about what we are seeing happening in Gaza. And as you know, Gaza has been under a blockade since 2007. People cannot leave. We heard that evacuation order from the IDF telling people to move from the north to southern Gaza, where airstrikes have continued. And of course, as we've heard from many on the ground, including many medical staff that we've spoken to on the ground, they aren't able to evacuate most of the majority of those living in the north, or rather at least some of those living in the north. We're talking about the elderly, children, some in hospital who simply cannot leave. Doctors from Doctors Without Borders have told us that they refuse to evacuate because they cannot evacuate hundreds of patients, and they will remain in place in northern Gaza to provide care for them. This is a humanitarian catastrophe, and as we know, this is a densely populated area. It's about just over twice the size of Washington, D.C., hugely crammed with civilians. And when we see these airstrikes happening, we know the IDF says it is targeting Hamas positions, Hamas targets, but these civilian death toll that we are seeing that is rising is, in some ways, according to rights groups, inevitable because of how densely populated this area is. And we've seen that in the mounting death toll. We've seen that in the mounting death toll of children.
Nada Bashir, thank you so much for that report.